Welcome to Density's webinar on our Workplace Benchmark Report. Today, I'm joined by Kevin Alborn and Philip Thrift, and we're super excited to talk about the trends that we're seeing in workplace in the report that we launched on last year's, on 2023. And so I'll start here by giving everyone a chance to give some intros. And so first, Philip, do you want to give us an intro on who you are and your background?
Yeah, sure thing, Annie. And thanks for having me on the webinar. My name is Philip Thrift. I've been with CBRE for 6 years now, and I lead our global workplace utilization practice. Really, I help our corporate occupier real estate clients envision and implement technology-enabled utilization data programs.
Awesome. Thanks. And then Kevin?
Hey, I'm Kevin Alborn. I'm at LinkedIn. I lead our workplace data and analytics team. I've been in this role for about 2 years. Prior to that, I led our workplace research and strategy team for a few years. So for the last 5 years or so, I've really been trying to understand the direction work is headed, how workplace can influence work, and really just trying to learn as much as we can about the behaviors we're seeing with our employees within the office space.
Awesome. Thanks to you both for your time today. Again, really excited for the conversation. I should probably introduce myself too. So I am Annie, and I'm the Director of Analytics and Insights at Density. And and like I said, we put together this report to look at trends in the industry last year, and we're looking forward to sharing some of those insights today and getting into a little bit of a conversation around each topic. So let's get into it. As part of the report, we looked at 400 workplaces in the US. So across the East Coast, West Coast, in the central US, and we analyzed 1 year of data. And we'll start by just looking at utilization, right? So a good place, a good setup for the analysis. So looking at utilization across 2023, we saw that utilization was pretty stable, right? We were at about 27% and a little bit of variation across regions, but generally flat. So I'm really interested, just like starting here, kind of getting the conversation going. Like, is this good? Like, how are we doing? Maybe Philip, you could chime in a little bit here to tell us, like, what do you think seeing this and kind of looking at the last year of trends?
I think it's easy to just ask the question you just asked, is this good or is this bad? I think the kind of general consensus is RTO mandates, other hybrid policies are in place, especially in the US, have been since the quote unquote official end of the pandemic. And this number has persisted, at least in the US, 30 to 35% kind of average daily peak. And so we've seen this from Density, I've seen this from other reports. And so the question that goes all the way up to the head of real estate organizations or even the C-suite is, why isn't this higher? Especially if it conflicts with some of the other reports we see coming out of, data sets that are a little, I think, less reliable, or maybe define utilization a different way that say the number is higher, or even looking pre-pandemic where we were probably 65%. So the question is it bad that we're so much different now? And I think you could probably say that we have all this vacant space. The commercial real estate market, especially on the transactions brokerage side, is struggling. We've got a lot of landlords holding a lot of space that they're expecting a compression or contraction around the leasing. But there's also something that becomes interesting around the average daily peak includes days of the week where we know hybrid policies say employees don't have to go in the office. And I think we'll get to a more nuanced approach to how the intra-week or intra-day shifts around peak utilization may justify the need for more space than a chart like this actually shows. So is it bad? Potentially, if we're using a lot of dollars or a lot of energy on real estate that's underutilized consistently, but could be maybe not as bad as it looks if part of the time that the workplace is actually well utilized and employees feel like they're effective and productive in that space.
Yeah, totally. And I think we always talk about on my team, a bunch of data scientists, how like kind of averages are even meaningless, right? It's really not telling the full story, but it's a good place to start. And yeah, and I appreciate your sort of lead in actually to the next slide. And I'll be interested in Kevin, you jumping in here, that, right, this isn't the whole story. Like, I think it hasn't, the general trend hasn't changed, but what's happening within the week and across the days is maybe what's different.
Yeah, and Philip, to your point, like one of the things we started doing is we just look at Tuesday to Thursday utilization now, because
Mhm.
that Monday and Friday you see this huge drop off. So it's sort of like what's happening on those core days, and how does that start to influence how we're planning for space in the future? Because Monday and Friday pull down the average to a place where it's like, well, everything's fine. We don't really have, a lot of folks coming in or don't have high utilization in some of these key offices. And the reality is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it could be much higher. Question I would have with this data is too, like, how is utilization being calculated? Like, what's the denominator here? Is it all seats? Is it standard work points? Is it desks? Is it something else? Because depending on how you measure it, this number could vary wildly. Also, like, are you including buildings that you aren't occupying, things like that? So I think there's a lot that goes into this. To Philip's point, and the number just at face value, I think the answer is like, is this good? Is it bad? Like, well, it depends. And it depends on a number of different things and how you define it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you all you're in the analytics space, right? So you get that deciding on the right way, like when you're trying to look at a metric across like 400 different workplaces in the US, where like actually each team and kind of company maybe measures it a little bit differently, is that, so it's not going to be perfect. Here we used like the capacity of the space, and so this capacity, how we're even using capacity is going to vary by company and by how they're thinking about space. And so, yeah, I agree.
Mhm.
The utilization metric it is not like a one size fits all, and that denominator is really important.
So Annie, when you prepared this report, did Density come up with their definition of utilization and apply it across all of your client portfolios, or did you actually ask your clients how they define utilization and build that into the way you aggregated the report?
Yeah, so I think kind of a combination, right? Like we work directly with our clients on defining the metrics that work for them. So in some cases, utilization is going to be like in maybe a more agile space. It's going to be a desk-based denominator. So the number of people within the space divided by the number of people or the number of desks as in that space. But for here, yeah, we use like a generalized capacity, which like again is not perfect. But we do see a lot of clients who think about utilization or occupancy that way. So I think it works as a starting point. Yeah. So let's maybe keep going because we have a lot to share. I'll keep us moving. All right. So Philip, you just brought this up, but basically, we all, and this is not surprising, right? So on the left, we have a chart that shows the utilization by day of the week, and so you can see Mondays and Fridays much lower. Tuesdays are the most popular day, and we're seeing, that kind of midweek hump is a lot where there's a lot more people in the office. It obviously varies by company and by workplace. But we found when we looked across these 400 workplaces that 82% of the offices were on some sort of hybrid schedule. So they had at least one day that wasn't in the office. On the right, we have a plot of what the typical shape of the day is. So over the course of the day, what does occupancy look like, and how does that change? And so the kind of darker blue line here shows what the most common pattern was. And that's what you would expect, right? People come in, it peaks mid-morning, you have like a lunchtime dip when maybe people leave their desk, go to other places for lunch, and then it peaks again in the afternoon. But what's also interesting here is that there are other patterns. And so this morning peak in the yellow line is an earlier peak in the day. And then we have some offices that peak in the afternoon, and then some that suspiciously probably have the cafe on them, or the place where people are going to lunch is that kind of like midway peak. So lots of things to discuss here. I guess my main questions about this for you, as kind of you guys working in the space, and particularly I think interested in Kevin at LinkedIn, how are you guys designing for these different shapes, right? The highs and lows of the week, and then also like thinking about different patterns of usage across the day.
Yeah, when it comes to like the week, as I mentioned before, we're looking really at Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because we're seeing this kind of the same thing. You have this head and shoulders kind of shape of the work week. At LinkedIn, we're seeing peaks on Wednesday, but it's not surprising to me. You're seeing a peak on a Tuesday or potentially even Thursday. as things kind of normalize here. So when we're looking for like space, how much space we need, that's kind of where we're focusing in on right now, as opposed to the entire week. When it comes to the shape of the day, we're seeing like this blue line here. We look at conference room utilization where we have density sensors, and we're seeing this exact same shape. And one of the things we're reporting on is like peak conference room time. It's from 10 to 12 and 1 to 3. And that's when we're seeing conference rooms most heavily used. And then people go to lunch and then come back in the afternoon and use them again. And then by 3 o'clock, you start to see some people start to leave for the day or shift their work away from conference rooms. So that is something we're really keeping an eye on, because when we think of space, generally what we see is we're running out of space in one of two ways. It's either desks for employees to work from within a neighborhood or conference rooms. And once you break in either of those ways, conference rooms or desks in a neighborhood, you start to hear noise from the business. So that's really something we want to keep an eye on to make sure that we're providing the right amount of space and the right types of space for our employees to utilize throughout the day.
Yep. Yeah, and Philip, you mentioned something earlier about how, you know, and we'll get into this a little bit, that there's a lot of space that's not being used, right? But in this new kind of formation and these new patterns in the workplace, we still might not have the right amount of the right kind of space, right? So maybe can you talk a little bit more about kind of what you're seeing your clients do, and how are we addressing this again, like new shape of working?
I think a lot of clients are very early on in the conversation around how to define whether a workplace and the design of is effective or not. And the first thing, back to the previous slide, and I think this chart on the left, Kevin's already spoken to really well, which is the days where the hybrid policy says employees or teams and the leaders have designated employees to be in the office, are they coming in effectively? And if that's true, then the space may be effective. Talking about this concept of office vibrancy, when you go into the office, are other people there? Does it feel like a lot of people are there? Can you see them, or they hold away in offices? And I really like to look at the shape of the day. And I think this is a data set that really is enabled through technology and hasn't traditionally been available. Where are people coincidentally throughout the day by time? And I think there's a concept that's kind of coming out, if you read anything on the future of work or any of the thought leadership coming around the future of work around this concept of coffee badging. And it's really taken very negatively, right? Employees are told to go in, so they show up, they badge in, they grab a cup of coffee or a lunch, or they leave. But I was talking to somebody else on the client side about 2 weeks ago, and she was talking about how they're seeing that coffee badging tends to be linked to a duration of 2 to 3 hours. So an employee comes in, they badge in, they stay 2 to 3 hours, and they leave. And I think we have some curves here that are really showing that behavior. And so again, my question goes back to effectiveness of the workplace. Yes, it's not fully utilized Monday through Friday, nor is it utilized 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. But if the workplace is available and enabling employees to get some level of collaborative work or in-person work that they can't get done at home as effectively, and the organization is enabling them to change how they work between the remote office, right, and the in-person office, does that mean that the workplace is effective? And can we start to envision and think about how we design workplaces and the plans for space and how we assign people to them, with the knowledge that maybe they do only come in 4 hours a day, 3 days a week, but is that a bad thing? Back to your question previously, is it good or bad? I'd actually like to ask Kevin's opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think if you're coming in for a few hours, 2, 3, 4, like you're coming in, you're doing the work you need to do. And if you have to leave, like in some ways, that's the point of a hybrid, and it's the point of having flexibility. It's for you to be able to use the space you need when you need it, whether that's your home office or the actual in-office. We actually did look at coffee badging because it was all over like the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks back. And I was waiting for one of our executives to say, like, is this happening here? So we just like took the initiative and looked at it, but we really looked at it like half hour or less. Like, are you truly coming in, swiping, getting a coffee and leaving? And it's like such a small percentage of people at our company that I was like, this isn't, we looked at it, this is not a problem for us to go sell for. So that's where we left it. It may be in other organizations, it may be a problem, but like if we're having folks come in and they're spending a couple hours in the office, like that's up to them, their manager, and how their team is working, and perhaps that works really well for them.
Yeah, and I think when we're like measuring success, which kind of goes along with what you were talking about, the vibe in the space, it's really about like the quality of the time spent, right? Like the quality of the interactions, the quality of the work you get done when you go to the office. And so one thing that, it's wonderful to have the data we have at Density because we have this kind of unbiased, quantitative view of what's happening in space when we can use it to make decisions, but like it is not the whole story. And that's where we rely on our clients and qualitative research and to kind of fill in that. And I think there's still like work to be done in how we really measure and report on the success. So, okay, let's keep going. I think we can come back to the highs and lows if we have some time, because I think there's a lot to talk about there. So one of the things that was really surprising and is a consistent trend, I think, in like all the reporting that's coming out is how much space is just not being used, right? So we looked at this a number of ways, and we found that like surprisingly that like about 50% of the spaces across these 400 workplaces were not being used for the majority of the day. So that's 7 hours that individual room or that space is just not, no one is in it. That desk, no one is using it. And so I think this is like, there's a big challenge here, right, for our industry to address this. And I'll go to the next slide, and we can kind of break it down by space type. And so where we're seeing this the most, I think, programmatically throughout the workplaces is around desks and open collab spaces also. So which there's a variety of definitions of that, I think, throughout the portfolio. So that one's like a little bit murkier. But desks that are sitting empty for the majority, more than 50%, or the majority of the day, more than 50% of the desks in this study were sat empty for the majority of the day. That's a lot. So I'm curious, how maybe like what you're seeing, Kevin, across your portfolio, and how you are and how you're thinking about, what do we do with these underused spaces, and yeah. So, and maybe we start around desks in particular, because it's kind of a hot topic. Yeah.
I can go first on the desk component of this.
Yeah.
Like, to me, this isn't really that surprising. We did observation. Philip and I were talking about observation studies before the call started. We've done loads of observation studies, 2016, 17, 18, 19, and consistently, regardless of engineering, finance, sales, whatever, regardless of location, desk utilization was about 30%. So the fact that it's still in and around there doesn't really surprise me, because I don't think people's behaviors have shifted that much in the past 4 years.
Yeah.
So I think when people are going into the office, they're working in a way that they kind of did in the past. They're using their desk as a really expensive coat rack.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like in a situation where you're agile to some degree, at least, or you have some amount of desk sharing, I think I think there's more flexibility, but I guess the concern for me is, especially in like a one-to-one office where you're really not using that space efficiently for the day, like, do we have way too much space, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And also to Philip's point about the vibe and like the energy in the space, it
Yeah.
really kills the energy when you go into a neighborhood and it's just a sea of empty workstations, because everyone's in conference rooms or in co-working space. They're somewhere else in the building. They're there, but they're not in that neighborhood. Perhaps that neighborhood should be half the size that it actually is, or even a quarter of the size. So to your point, right sizing the amount of space potentially is important. Like, to me, the biggest challenge with all of this is getting buy-in with the business and getting them to understand and realize the value of having the right size space and not having an excess of space, because it can be very problematic to just how people feel when they come and the experience they have when they're in the office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you'll see on this breakdown as well, so what are the best use spaces? Well, meeting rooms, enclosed workspaces, spaces with walls. We don't have phone booths on here, but I think that's included in the enclosed workspace. So those spaces, looking at this, and if we just looked at this data, we could say, oh, so great, everybody's going to the office and they're meeting and they're collaborating, right? And they're working together. And this is, they're having that quality time. But maybe maybe we move to meeting rooms it's a good kind of next topic. But I think we all know that that's not exactly right what's happening in our spaces. So
I think there's one more comment
yeah, go
that I
ahead.
wanted to add here, Annie. Sorry to slow you down.
No, great.
One, I don't think this is that surprising in that other benchmarking reports that are available show kind of the same pattern of the most to the least used space types by time, if not by capacity. And two, I think you do always kind of need to think about baking in growth. So our space planners who inform our space designers, our occupancy planners inform our space designers that most clients are going to need 10 to 15% of vacancy in any given leased space or owned space just for the expectation of growth and an additive of headcount. Maybe this isn't necessarily the right time to talk about that, but in general, you want space. So
Yeah, of course.
if you're showing 50% vacancy and 15% of that is by design, the number is actually 35. And that's not that bad, right? That's,
Mhm.
I mean, it's still a third more space than you need, or it's a third of your spaces are ineffective. And then the final point I'll make is open collaboration space is really cheap and it looks great in photos.
Mhm.
But what I think is happening, this is kind of my personal conjecture, is the employee types, professional workers that were forced to work from home during the pandemic, and then have since been asked to come back in a hybrid capacity. Everybody went through this transformation around digital collaboration. So everybody knows how to use Teams and Slack and Zoom and all these different video conferencing tools, and we all collaborate on Miro boards and other things online. So I think people are coming back into the office because they're being told to, but they're still doing the same work they were transitioned into over the course of the pandemic. And it is a terrible experience to run or participate on a virtual meeting in an open space. And
Mhm.
if your half of your employees are other places around the world, which is true for a lot of corporations now, because we went out and we hired the best talent we could get, regardless of their physical location, half your meeting may be digital and half your meeting may be in person. Well, you can't do that in an open collaboration space. You can't do that very effectively in desks. So the space types that are least conducive to physical digital hybrid collaboration are the space types that are least utilized. And I think that's not a surprise at all. So the question becomes, is there a change management program needed for organizations in the way we do work and the type of work we're expected to do in person? Or do we just need to scrap these space types that are not conducive to the new way of working? That's probably an organization by organization challenge, but Kevin, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how LinkedIn is tackling that.
It's everything you just said is spot on. You know, I think we lost a lot from 2019. 2019, people used to be very comfortable taking phone calls out in the open space, out in the neighborhood. And then everyone worked from a home office for the most part for a few years. They're not comfortable taking calls out in the open anymore. So it's a cultural shift. We're now like trying to push back to say, no, like as a salesperson, like we want you taking calls out in the neighborhood. You don't have to get a phone booth or a conference room for every single phone call you make.
Yeah.
A number of sales managers want that. They want to overhear the phone call to help coach their junior employees on what to say and how to handle situations. So I think everything you said is spot on. I do think there's a significant amount of change management that needs to be done to really to either show employees how to use the space or to potentially change out the space to provide something that is more effective for what employees are trying to do.
One thing I'm curious about, and I've heard a little bit, but not like I've heard a little bit about this, but I don't know that I've heard too much about it. Not as much as I'd hope to. Is what about like changing our schedules or like aligning like the in-person day? You can't have not like you can't, but maybe like discouraging virtual calls on those days, or like is anyone doing that? And are are your clients doing that, Philip, or are you guys doing that at all? Like, did teams like have a day where they're like, no, we're just together? Because I feel like that would help relieve a lot of this. When you're in person, and when you're
Mhm.
you're remote, you're remote. Um,
I've heard of a few clients piloting it. Most of it, they're trying to just establish anchor days so teams can share space. So you essentially assign more employees to space than you have capacity for them to attend concurrently. And you say, okay, accounting, you're going to come in. You drew the short straw. You got to come in on Monday, but sales, sorry, you got to be there on Friday, or maybe not because they're out playing golf with clients. But it's that kind of thing, right? You anchor the days, but I haven't seen a lot of clients really experiment with we're going to go into no meetings days or focus days
right.
only. I think most clients are lucky to even have their employees block out 2 hours a day to do focus
I
work.
know. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think there's a huge
Yeah.
room for improvement there and the change management front and the cultural change front. Because I don't know about you, but many of my days end up being back to back to back 30-minute meetings, and I can't get any actual work done.
Right.
Yeah, I think again, Philip, you hit the nail on the head on a number of those topics. For in-person stuff, like we have a ton of our teams are distributed. So even if like everyone in the location is there, they still have people in Chicago or New York. So even if they're in the office, it's still somebody on VC. The percentage of teams that we have that are entirely in one location is so
Yeah.
so small at this point. The idea of just getting everyone together in the same physical space to work and not have to worry about VC, it's unrealistic in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. So it kind of goes back to what you were saying about just like needing to provide, like we need to be realistic about the spaces that are really useful right now, and then make sure that we provide environments in order to, work with kind of how we're working these days. And so a lot of that is thinking about calls, right? So, or taking virtual calls and the behaviors around that. Okay, so let's move to the another result from the report, and a way at Density that we specifically think about supply and demand in offices, and particularly the relationship between meeting room saturation, as we call it, or the availability of meeting rooms, and floor utilization. So this is a chart, a version of this that we use often with our clients, and it's in our Atlas application. And what it does is on the y-axis, you have meeting room saturation. So the availability of meeting rooms decreases actually as you go up. So as meeting rooms fill up on the y-axis, we're comparing that to floor utilization, more people coming in. So this is really the relationship between rooms being used and availability and the number of people on the floor. And in a lot of cases, and in like kind of healthier space planning scenarios or sort of successes, I would say the relationship is really predictable. And that's what you see plotted here, like a floor where, as more people come on the floor, meeting rooms fill up. And there's actually probably too many meeting rooms here because there's a lot of space in that top right quadrant. But what I plotted on here and what we looked at in the report was what does meeting room saturation look like on average across the portfolio? And you can see looking at it by industry in the report. But the average is actually pretty low. The average utilization that floors are hitting when they're starting to fill up meeting rooms, and it's pretty concerning around how our spaces are currently designed. And so what we're seeing is that at 45% utilization, so maybe half of the number of people the floor is designed for, meeting rooms are reaching 80% saturation or only 20% availability. And so we, I think like it depends kind of on the floor and the specific company and their space, but generally we are running out of meeting rooms, right? And so I think back to some of the discussion we've already been having, it's a lot of this has to do with behavior, right? And those virtual calls. How are you guys thinking about programming and the right numbers and sizes of rooms for to fit the needs of your the workplaces that you're thinking about? Maybe, I don't know who wants to jump in here.
I can start.
Yeah.
Because we've done a lot of work actually with Density trying to figure this out and plot kind of where we are. I think to your point, like behavior is a huge part of this. And I think some of it's like poor behavior. When you have really low floor utilization, almost like everyone can get their own conference room. So they do. So conference room utilization takes off because everyone's like working in a private office. But that's a behavioral change management issue. You have to almost reach a critical mass of floor utilization to really understand like, all right, how many rooms do we need? But interestingly enough, we found that the amount of rooms we need is similar to what we needed back in 2019, which is essentially 1 room for every 5 employees we have on site. And that was the same kind of metric we used 5 years ago now. We're still kind of landing in the same space. So we're not at the point where we're saying, hey, we need more rooms and just going to start building more conference rooms, because that ratio, like 1 to 5, that's a lot of rooms.
Yeah.
So we're really hesitant to kind of go beyond that right now until we see something like materially change in the data over the next couple of years, and perhaps we change our programming ratios again at some point.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to hear that it's about the same. And I think your point too about how behavior changes as the office fills up is it's something we're talking a lot about too, because I think that there's hesitancy to add more people to a space when, so desks are not being, fully used. We know that. But meeting rooms are in demand, right? And so there's hesitancy to add more people to a space because it seems like, well, we'll put pressure on meeting rooms and then everybody will be, frustrated because they can't find one. But there's actually something that we kind of know that we have intuition about that, when there is space, you're going to use it. When you can go in a big private room by yourself because nobody's there, I think it'll be interesting and we're doing this with a few clients, is like making some changes to their spaces and then seeing what happens like as more people come in. Like, does the curve shift down? Also, a large portion of these meetings, and if you take out all the meetings where someone is on a virtual call, like looking at that trend, or just one person in a room, you actually see the curve go way down, right? So I think like we're good at sharing. We can, like people, we sort of just need to have this trust that like, we'll share, right? And that maybe when there's available space, like behaviors are a little bit different than when like you have a lot of people in the office and that like resources are a little bit more limited. So then kind of just on that last point, which I sort of gave away, but we're talking about it already, is that we are seeing that obviously a lot of the meeting room usage, and I'll go to the next slide, is just by one person, right? So there are, about half of the meetings that we looked at in this analysis were just not really meetings. They were, either someone doing focus work or having a virtual call and in the space all by themselves. And so efficiency wise, we're not doing great because we're all using a lot more space, than we need. And so I guess maybe on this, I was going to ask this too, Kevin, do you guys have phone booths, or do you have a lot of options for individuals to get the kind of the privacy they need for calls?
We do, but this could be our data you're looking at because it's very similar. The majority of meetings are one person or less. So a couple things we're trying to do around this is, one, having like what we talked about earlier, team days where it's like, all right, everyone comes in. If everyone's coming in together, even if their team is distributed, and they have folks in Chicago or New York, there's still 3 or 4 people in that office in Mountain View, and they can be in a larger conference room together as opposed to just one person in a room somewhere. We're also experimenting with places for people to get together outside of conference rooms to get work done. And to Philip's point, like, I don't think they work great for the video component, but if you do have a few people that just need to collaborate over something, is there an environment we can create in a neighborhood, like a team room or team anchor space in the neighborhood, that people can get together and get work done? So this data, like, we're seeing the exact same type of behavior. And I think a lot of companies are, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that most teams are distributed, and hybrid work, we're just not seeing a critical mass of the same group of people that work together in the office at the same time.
Anything to add on that, Philip, in terms of behavioral changes, change management, successes you're seeing and kind of dealing with this trend?
2 things. I think the first is many spaces are just outdated. They're seas of desks, one-to-one assignments, many C-suite mandates still expect people want a desk when they come into the office, and they will be more encouraged to come in the office if there's a desk. I think the more progressive clients would push back on that. Kevin, you would probably push back on that. But that's kind of the first one, is it's expensive to renovate space. And if that very first chart showed there's only 35% utilization, why would we? People have a place to go. We don't really need to spend any time renovating. Maybe when this lease is due, and there are 3 other leases in the metro area due in the next 24 months or 36 months, that's when we'll consider a redesign. We'll spend all the money we're going to save by closing down 2 offices. We're going to reassign all those people. We're going to go from a 1-to-1 to a 1.7 to 1. And that's when we're going to cut a lot of desks. And our workplace strategy team does a lot of work with clients trying to make those decisions on that transactional basis of, we've got a general plan standard pre-pandemic, it was probably 70% me space and 20% we space. And now those numbers have flipped. But then are you running out of desks conversely? So
Yeah.
that's the first point, is as overall office utilization goes up, either by mandates actually starting to work, which they're not, I think we've seen, or transaction-driven densification, that's when the need for behavioral change around there's no longer a meeting room available for you to just go sit in and work, or your team needs to start thinking about occupying a neighborhood and a zone and being more flexible about which space type applies to what versus before. And maybe the true everything's flexible hoteling model doesn't work, right? Maybe you should be booking a block of desks for your entire team at a time the days they're anchored to come into the office. I think that's a lot of change management stuff and reservation systems and all these other technologies that now real estate leaders have to even consider funding and deploying. But the second one, I think, is really kind of going back to this effectiveness conversation of utilization over time. And if you think about, so I was talking to a client very recently. They have their future of work design and they're doing some studies on it and how effective it is. And they have this area kind of in the middle that is an open area. It's got a bunch of different furniture types. It's sized for about 18 people. And it's intended to be used by a team to do their weekly Scrum stand-up all at once. And then when that meeting is not happening, it's just touchdown space. You can go sit there and have a coffee and talk to somebody, or you can just put your laptop in between. You got meeting rooms, you got 5 or 15 minutes in between, just sit down there and plug in your laptop and fire off a couple emails. And this person's thought was, well, if the stand-up meeting or planned event can happen every week and all those people can be in person together running through their list of activities for the week, that's effective, even if it's only used by 2 to 6 people the rest of the time. So I think this conversation of efficiency versus effectiveness and what we measure and what we track and how we grade or score real estate becomes a really interesting transition of like mental model almost. And how do we talk about the value of real estate, or the value of the office, the value of the workplace?
Like a really, really, like, a high quality interaction in a large space with more people than that happens once a month, or, that sort of like could make it worth it, right? And it's not all equally valued, and we need to think about that. Yeah. One thing has been interesting. So we're working right now on a research partnership with Hassel, and I'll go to the next slide with Hassel. So Daniel Davis has been working with Density in order to do like a more in-depth analysis of our technology workplaces in their technology kind of the industry across the US. And we've been looking more at how different space types are being used and kind of doing a spatial analysis that goes further than this report. And one of the surprising kind of like early insights, just as like a preview from that, is how private offices are used. Private offices are actually, we're seeing meetings happen in private offices, which like is totally fine, right? Like that's like that's a good use of that. But like, I think what you were saying before about, a 3-person meeting can happen in the open collab space. Like we need to be a little bit more flexible. And so like trying to provide a variety of spaces, but not, but also being intentional and curating those spaces so they work for the behavioral patterns we're seeing is really important. So yeah, so we will keep working on it. I think we're all working hard on this. Very interesting to have this discussion with you guys today. I really appreciate your time. Again, Kevin Albarn from LinkedIn and Philip Thrift from CBRE. We at Density are, again, working hard to try to understand trends across the portfolio. It's a really fun space to be in, and we'll be launching this next report in partnership with Hassel in the next couple of months. So yeah, thank you so much, and hope you guys have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Annie. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Annie. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Bye.